So what was your overall impression of the Rio+20 summit so far?
It was a mad gig. And I use that phrase because I travelled here from Madrid, and the three-letter code for the airport there is MAD. Three-letter code for Rio de Janeiro airport is GIG. And so my luggage tag on my suitcase said mad gig. And I thought how beautifully that summed up this conference of pointy heads here in Rio, which finished the day before we recorded this on the seafront here. Now, the extraordinary thing about this conference was just how many pointy heads there were supposed to be from around the world coming to it. The UN said that 50,000 were going to come. I guess that less than 10,000 actually turned up. I think this whole conference, right from the start, has had the stink of death upon it. The environment is no longer cool. It's no longer green. It's no longer fashionable, except among a few youthful ideologues and among the grasping capitalists, Marxist capitalists, if you like, of the green movement, who have made so much money, chiefly at taxpayers' expense, exploiting various so-called green issues. The week before this conference here in Rio, there was a preliminary conference organised by ICLEI, which is a group devoted to applying the principles of the 1992 Rio conference to local administrations and governments all around the world. And at that meeting, at which we had spies listening in, they were saying to each other, we can no longer talk about Agenda 21 in the context of the environment, because the environment, thanks to those wretched skeptics, has become a dirty word. It's no longer fashionable, it's no longer cool. We won't be able to win the argument if we talk about the environment anymore. We can't talk about climate change because even we have to admit it's not happening as they said. We can't talk about green issues because, frankly, in the West, the environment is largely quite well regulated altogether, and it's just been vastly overblown. They themselves were saying this. They were saying we cannot justify an environmental agenda, which is what Agenda 21 is supposed to be, in environmental terms. Now, this is an extraordinary admission. What they should have done, therefore, is to say we don't need Agenda 21. But of course they do need it. They need it just as the people here in Rio who are at this conference needed this environmental thing, because their real ambition has nothing whatever to do with the environment. I first learnt this when the late Eric Ellington, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, who became quite a friend of mine and was a genuine environmentalist, nobody more non-political than he, told me that a couple of years after they had founded Greenpeace, they had all had to leave because they weren't politicians and they weren't political. They didn't know how to deal with the Marxists, who, he said, had taken over the organisation for purposes that clearly had nothing to do with the environment and were everything to do with destroying the economies of the West as fast as possible from within without a shot being fired. And I said to him, Eric, I said, look, you're about as political as a rabbit. And you're talking about Marxists having taken over your movement. Doesn't this all sound a bit kind of flaky and extreme? He said, look, that's what happened. The Berlin Wall came down, all these people piled out of it, piled into the green movement, and they've taken it over and they're running it. He said, I call them watermelons. They're green on the outside and red on the in. My own phrase for these people who are at this Rio conference is the traffic light tendency. The green's too yellow to admit they're really reds. And this conference, from their point of view, has been a resounding failure. And from my point of view, as somebody who loves the West and would like to see it survive without being destroyed from within, it was a triumphant success. They had hoped to get the nations of the world to make binding commitments effectively to allow the United Nations to become a sort of world government. Now, you may think, listening to this, that that's rather extreme, talking about global government. Well, Al Gore's been talking about it, Jacques Chirac of France has been talking about it, Jacques Attali of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been talking about it. An awful lot of politicians have been talking about the desirability of, as they see it, global government. We know from the September the 15th, 2009 draft of what had been intended to be the Copenhagen Treaty, which fortunately failed when it was exposed to the public gaze, that they were indeed intending to put forward a 186-page blueprint for a global government with all its structures, all its revenue sources, the direct power of taxation given to the UN over the members of the UN, direct powers of environmental intervention, and the word government actually appears in this context twice in the draft of the treaty. You'll find it at Annex 1, sections 36 and 38. And they wanted to do the same here. They realized they could no longer bring forward the climate as an excuse, and you barely heard climate change mentioned here. Oh, it's still in the text. It's still there, but it's no longer the number one issue. In fact, right at the outset of the document that they have apparently agreed here, we weren't allowed into the conference even though we were accredited to it, because the UN has changed its policy. It doesn't want people like me getting in and talking to the delegates. We might persuade them that all this is unnecessary. But the beginning paragraph of this document said that the worst problem facing the world was not climate change, but poverty. Now that I find myself in agreement with. Poverty is completely unnecessary. It arises almost exclusively from socialism. There's no longer any environmental reason why people should be poor. There's enough food to go around, there's enough land to go around, there's enough water to go around, there's enough of everything to go around, even if the population grows to 7 or 8 billion. It's actually 7 billion. I think they say it's going to grow to 9 or maybe 10 by 2050 to 2060. The world can sustain that comfortably, without species loss, without environmental damage. And we can make all of those people prosperous as well. This is not a problem. Natural resources are, of course, finite, but they're so plentiful that with our population, they're not going to run out. We're simply not numerous enough for that to happen. So the fact that now it is acknowledged that environmental concerns are not number one, and the climate concerns are not number one, that poverty is number one, the focus shifts back from the pseudo-morality of the environmental movement to the hard-headed economics of making sure that the world's peoples prosper. And what is interesting about this is that if you lift people like those of Brazil from out of the poverty of the favelas you can see here in Rio and up to something closer to the standard of living we are fortunate enough to be able to take for granted in the West, then you also stabilize the population. Population does not expand with prosperity, it stabilizes with prosperity. It expands with poverty. And so if you want to stop the rampant growth of global human population, then it is most important to make the world prosperous, to lift the poor out of their poverty. This is not only a practical and economic and environmental imperative, of course it's also a moral imperative. We are the lords of creation. As far as we can see, we possess that combination of the three great powers of the soul, memory, understanding, and will, to a degree that no other creature possesses. Now, we should use this power that we have responsibly to live in coexistence with our fellow creatures and also with the plant kingdom. Our footprint on the world should not be too heavy. The deforestation that's evident here in Brazil should be discouraged and reversed. The overfishing of the world's oceans should be discouraged and reversed, or many of the world's pelagic species will become extinct over the next 20 or 30 years. These are real environmental concerns. But these concerns were not talked about here at this conference. Instead, they were still effectively talking about a mechanism for setting up a global government so that they could shut down the West, shut down democracy, and bring freedom to an end worldwide. Well, they lost. They lost, and they lost big time. They, of course, did the usual ritual declaration that they succeeded, but they didn't. I now think there's a good chance the West can survive the environmental movement. I think the environmental movement itself will from here on decline. Indeed, it largely survives today only because governments are goofy enough to give it taxpayers' money in improbably large amounts. But its days are numbered. We shall soon get back to addressing real environmental problems and no longer wasting our time with Rio+20, with climate change, or any of the other fancy nonsenses that the environmental movement has attempted to foist upon us, not for environment, but for purely Marxist political reasons. The game is up.